So in this lecture, I just kind of want to go over the .NET framework and sort of the history of it again, just to really make sure that this concept sinks in, because it can be kind of confusing because Microsoft has created so many different versions and it just kind of keeps getting convoluted. So I wanted to create this lecture just to kind of reiterate this whole concept of what the .NET framework really is. So the framework is just an API. It's just Microsoft's way of creating all these class libraries for you, all this code ahead of time so that you can just drag and drop a button or access a database. All of this code that they've pre-written for you, that's part of the .NET framework. It's also the compiler and various other things. So over time, they've created new versions of the .NET framework. And I'm going to go over some web pages here just to kind of help you get some history lesson of the .NET framework. So back in 2002, you'll notice the .NET Framework version 1.0 came about. And then over time, every couple months or every couple years, they had different version releases. So for instance, version 2.0 was a really big release back in 2007. And then 3.0, 4.0, et cetera, as we come all the way up to version 4.8. So this is supposedly going to be the last version of what they actually call the .NET framework. And so over the years, they just continually added on more and more features. So this kind of gives you a good little visual representation of some of the things that were added on over time. So in 2.0, you can say they added on Windows Forms, ASP.NET, ADO.NET, which is accessing databases, Common Language Runtime. Then they had a major upgrade to 3.0, which introduced Windows Presentation Foundation, WCF, WF, card spaces. Come over here, 3.5, they introduced LINQ and Entity Framework. 4.0, the Task Parallel Library, Parallel LINQ. So this had to do with all of parallelism in our code. And then 4.5, the asynchronous applications and the Universal Windows programs and various things. So you can see just again, over time, they've added more and more features, what we call this .NET framework. So now, as they were going along, what they realized was that there's just more and more platforms that people are trying to develop for. Not everyone is just trying to develop onto a Windows platform. Now, originally .NET was envisioned to be able to go anywhere, whether it was Linux or Windows or Mac, but it just never quite worked out that way. And pretty much it got locked into just Windows, or you could put it on a web server. And it had to be a Microsoft web server at that. So Microsoft realized, hey, the world is not just Microsoft, so we need to have a way of implementing this on Linux, on different operating systems or phones like an Android. So what they then did was they came up with this idea of something called .NET Core. Again, this is where it gets slightly confusing because now we have the .NET framework and we have the .NET Core, and these are going along now in parallel. So as they're making updates to the .NET framework, they're also now creating updates to the .NET Core. And so .NET Core, what they said is okay, we need to be able to create a cross-platform implementation of the .NET framework. So that way a person can just write an application once and that C# code or Visual Basic .NET code can run on Windows or Linux or Mac or an Android. So again, just imagine you're a large corporation, you're going to create an app and it's going to cost you $50 million, $10 million. But you can only write it for Windows. You can only write it for Mac. You can only write it for Android. This creates a huge problem in the world, of application development. So this was Microsoft's, sort of first stab at trying to make it so it can go across platform. So again, they kind of took that .NET framework, but the problem is that some features are just going to be locked into Windows, and that's kind of what happened is that if you wanted to use Windows Forms or WPF, you couldn't use this .NET Core framework. So that was the problem. And so here's another thing with what is the difference and trying to understanding what this .NET Core really is. And honestly, it just boils down to you're probably just running a server somewhere for the internet. That's probably the main reason you're going to use .NET Core. Again, so that it can run on Linux or Mac, or you had a console application, but you couldn't run WPF. You couldn't run Windows Forms apps on Mac, for instance. So at this point in time, it was like if you're writing a big application, it's pretty much .NET framework. If you had something server side services or anything like that, these low level code, you could then use this .NET Core. So Microsoft finally realized and kind of took a breath and said, listen, this is just not working out. We have this .NET framework, we have this .NET Core, we have all this other garbage going on, and it's really confusing people. And so they finally said, okay, we need to stop this. And we need to just create one sort of platform. And they call this now, they're calling it .NET 5. And so what they've done is they've gotten rid of what they called the .NET framework, they've gotten rid of what they called the .NET Core, and now we just have .NET 5 going forward. So basically they're just saying, we have the .NET framework going forward. And what they've done is they've said, okay, we need to just make everything common so that you can just write it once and use it anywhere. So now with .NET 5, you can write a desktop application, WPF, Windows Forms, things like that. You can still go to the web. You can go to the cloud. You can now write it on mobile or gaming or these Internet of Things applications and AI, and it can go cross-platform, for the Mac or Android, things like that. So now this is their whole goal going forward. So what they've actually done now is they've said, okay, we're going to stop development for .NET Framework. We're going to stop for .NET Core, and everything going forward is this idea of .NET 5. Now within our applications, if we come up here and bring Visual Studio, again, it can be a little bit confusing. I don't know why they chose the names this way, but if you go into a new project here and you bring this up, and you'll notice I have C#, Windows, and Desktop selected here. If you scroll down a little bit, you'll see they have Windows Forms Applications .NET Framework. And if you scroll down a little bit further, there's Windows Forms App.NET. Again, I have no idea why they chose these names. I'm sure in the future they'll fix it, but it's just confusing. It's just the way it is. So where it says Windows Forms Application .NET Framework, this is .NET Framework 4.8 or below. You can choose the framework. If you want to use .NET Core going forward, you would come down here and you would choose Windows Forms .NET. Same things for a WPF application. WPF app.NET Framework is the .NET Framework 4.8 or below, where if you come down here, the WPF app.NET is going to be this new, .NET, going forward, this common, not core, but it's the common going forward. So it can be a little bit confusing. In this course, if you just choose the .NET Framework here, or the .NET Framework here, I think that's going to be your easiest thing to do. But if you do happen to choose one of these others, it's not a big issue. You can either choose the .NET that Core, that 5.0. Sorry, I keep calling it Core, and it's really easy to fix it. But I think you'll just be better off using this .NET framework. From your programming standpoint, it should look pretty much exactly the same. But again, just realize that there's kind of this transition going on in Microsoft with the .NET framework and the Core and the 5.0. Thanks.